Happy Halloween, fine folks. It's that most wonderful time of year where the air gets a little bit cooler, the nights a little bit longer, and my hands a little bit more arthritic from hours of hand sewing. This year, I was inspired by the work of Gothic horror icon Edgar Allan Poe, specifically The Telltale Heart, a short story about a murder and a man's descent into madness. So, we had best get started, because we have an awfully long way to go. So this project is kind of just an amalgamation of a bunch of different smaller elements that I've been wanting to try to do. I've been wanting to do a sort of big ball gown project for a while since I've never made one, and I've been seeing these ribcage corsets online, like on Pinterest and Instagram, for a few years now at this point, and they're very cool looking, and I really want one. Also, I read the Locktomb series, and that made me really want one. I've also been seeing a lot of like really dramatic bedazzled beaded gloves that look really fun, and I really want to try them out. And I'm basically just always thinking about giant sleeves as a kind of background radiation for my mind. So I had all of these somewhat disparate elements floating around in my mind when I came across a dramatic reading online of The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, which I was familiar with. I think I had to read it in high school, but I hadn't read it in a long time, and hearing it with all of these ideas in my head just kind of sparked something, and I was like, ooh, I can loosely base a project on that. If you're not familiar with The Telltale Heart, I'll link it below. It's a pretty short story, but you can kind of see how some of these elements can tie together, with the ribcage corset being like modified to have a cavity where the heart could be ripped out from, and the big ball gown with the big sleeves can now have a historical influence from the time period of the story. Sort of. So I already don't do historical fashion in the way that some people do. Nothing that I do is historically accurate or even really trying. I do sometimes use historical methods and styles and that sort of thing, but it's all just vibes. I'm not going for accuracy. I'm barely even going for adequacy. So The Telltale Heart as a short story was released in 1843, and 1840s fashion is great, you know. It's got a lot of really interesting elements. But the 1830s are absolutely bananas. It's so weird. The sleeves are crazy. I love them so much. And 1843, that's early in the decade. That's close to the 1830s. I think the final design is going to end up being a bit more 1830s than 1840s. But it's also going to have a cage crinoline under the skirt, which weren't invented until like the late 1850s or 1860s, I think. So it's really not historically accurate. It's kind of a mishmash of a bunch of different decades in the Victorian era. It's gonna look cool, that's all I can say. I do have a design planned out. My design for this project is a fairly simple black dress. It'll have an off-the-shoulder bodice with a Bertha collar and giant pleated puff sleeves, and a very full cartridge pleated skirt. Over that will be the ribcage corset, with a cavity for the heart to have been torn out, which I plan to fully cover in beads. The look will be finished off with a set of gloves covered in rhinestones to look like blood-stained hands. So I want to start out with the dress. It's kind of the base of the whole design. I've already gone ahead and made the foundation layers in another video, so I think I'm going to start off with the bodice. For the bodice pattern, I initially planned on making a good old-fashioned plastic wrap and tape pattern over top of my corset, but it was not working out. It's already hard enough to wrap your own torso in packing tape, but trying to do it in a corset is even worse. I had resigned myself to waiting until I could get an extra pair of hands to help me out when I realized I wanted this bodice to fit nicely over the corset. I made the corset. I had a pattern. I could use that as a jumping off point. So I cut and assembled a mock-up version of the corset pattern. It's the red threaded 1880s pattern, if you're curious. I'll link it below. I cut all of the pieces just a hair bigger than the pattern so the bodice would fit over the corset. From there, I could try the mock-up on and make some adjustments. I shortened and reshaped the bottom edge into a basque waist and raised the top edge up by about an inch. I would also end up rounding out a little dip under the arms to make room for the sleeves, and combining a few of the original pattern pieces. The back and side back merged together, and the two center fronts became one piece cut on the fold. Okay, so I've been mocking up the bodice, and I think I'm pretty happy with how it's going. Also worked out the sleeves. They're fairly simple. They're just like gathered rectangles that kind of form a puff. I have some plans that are gonna complicate things, but at the core, they're pleated rectangles, and I think those will work perfectly fine. I have been struggling a bit with the Bertha. I think it just needs to be more reinforced, and I don't want to have to do all that for the mock-up. I'm using just quilting cotton for this mock-up, and in the final piece it's going to be like pleated polyester taffeta with interfacing and all this, so it's going to be heavily reinforced. So I think that'll be fine. The real issue I'm having is how to attach everything to each other. When I attach the Bertha to the top edge of the bodice and the edge of the sleeves, it doesn't sit nicely and I can't move my arms. So I think the answer is that the Bertha and the sleeves are not connected. Like the sleeves will attach to the bodice at the underarm, and then the Bertha will connect to the bodice at like the center front and center back. And then the Bertha and sleeves won't be attached at all, which does mean that like there could be some gaping between the sleeves and the Bertha, and there'll be like skin popping out. Ew. So that does cause another problem though, with the chemise showing through in the gaps between like the bodice and the sleeves and the Bertha. And I think the I think the easiest solution for that would be to make another chemise, which does feel kind of silly. Don't get on the ironing board. No. Hot iron. I just made a chemise. I think that video will be like a month old by this point that you're watching this, but for me it was last week. So I think I'm just gonna do a very simple like tube of fabric with elastic at the top. So it'll be totally sleeveless and just be a thing that sits between the corset and my skin. So I'm gonna make the chemise, and then I'm going to take apart my mock-up, transfer my pattern pieces to paper, and then I think I can get started on the real bodice. I cut 2 sets of bodice pieces, an outer and a lining layer, from this chonky cut of black taffeta. I assembled both layers by machine, then cut and assembled a cotton interlining layer as well. Once all of the seams had been pressed, I attached the lining and the interlining together by sewing boning channels. The boning in the bodice was pretty minimal, 3 at the center front to maintain that pointed waistline, and 2 at either edge of the center back opening to reinforce the eyelets. After test fitting the boning in the channels, I removed the bones so I could attach the outer layer by machine along the sides and bottom edge. Then I clipped the curves and corners and turned it all right side out. I reinserted the bones and then closed up the top edge by hand. Next I added the eyelets, which I kind of cheated at. I didn't have any sturdy, good quality grommets on hand in the right size, and I didn't want to spend hours and hours doing hand-sewn eyelets. I did have a bunch of those cheaper punch tool eyelets that are just crimped on with no washer, but I knew those would rip out of the fabric under the tension of the lacing, so I combined my 2 available options. I marked out the spacing, punched holes, and set in the eyelets. Then I colored over them with a black Sharpie just to keep any of the gold from peeking out, and then I whip-stitched over the eyelets with black embroidery floss to reinforce them. This still took a while, but was much faster than doing fully hand-sewn eyelets as neatly as I wanted for this garment. Like an hour versus hours. Okay, so the bodice is wearable. Got it all assembled. I just finished doing the eyelets, and I really like the way they came out. I think they're pretty nice. I'm a little out of breath because I just grabbed some random ribbon to use to lace up the bodice, and it's not quite long enough, so I have it laced a little bit too tight. So I need to get more ribbon, but another thing I need to do is make a modesty panel because that's not how that's supposed to look. So I'm going to try and measure behind me, at least get an estimate. Other fun element is I hurt my neck last week by trying to tie up my hair. But it's doing okay now, but it still kind of hurts when I turn my head too far. It's been a fun extra challenge for a project that involves a lot of checking and fitting on my back, so I can't like turn my head over my shoulder easily. But yeah, gonna make a modesty panel. She's sleek, like an eel. With some very deft and elegant maneuvering with the tape measure, I had a rough idea of how big to make the modesty panel. This was super simple, just 2 rectangles of taffeta, 1 reinforced with iron-on interfacing, sewn together and turned right side out. After a good press, I hand sewed it to the inside of the bodice along one edge of the opening. There's no closure to attach the modesty panel to the other side of the opening, it just gets held in place by the lacing. That finished off the base of the bodice, so it was time to move on to the sleeves. Okay, so I have moved on to working on the sleeves. My vision for the sleeves is just kind of like little pleated puff sleeves. On the mock-up, I did just like basic knife pleats just to keep things simple for that. For the real thing, I have a more complicated design in mind. I think they're called fan pleats, I'm pretty sure. At the very least, if you Google fan pleat, the reference image that I found originally comes up, so that's what I'm gonna call them. So what it is these like 2 layers of pleats that kind of come together and fold and mesh into each other to create this kind of like structural shape that's really cool. I've done a bunch of test pieces and samples and practicing to try and like work out a method that I really liked. They're actually like not too complicated, they're just really tedious to do, which is kind of like the story of this whole project. So how these work is they're actually just regular knife pleats, but they change direction halfway through. So you can see like on the top here, the pleats are kind of like folding in this direction, and then on the bottom they're folding in the opposite direction. So the folds invert halfway through. So, you know, when you're folding fabric for pleats, you have like mountain folds and valley folds. So the way these work is like you have like a mountain fold here, and then halfway through it becomes a valley fold, and that's what changes the directions of the pleats. And then you have this zigzag row of mountain folds to kind of connect the changing direction. If my explanation there was kind of confusing, I'll put like a diagram that I made on screen to kind of illustrate it a bit more. Honestly, I made the diagram for myself so I don't forget. So on that last sample that I showed you guys, I did 1-inch deep pleats, and I think that's just a little bit too big, so I'm going to do 1/2-inch deep pleats for the final thing. I am marking out those lines right now on my first sleeve piece, and the sleeve pieces are just long rectangles, 30 inches by 11. So the 30-inch will pleat down to about 1/3 of that, so it'll be about 10, which is the distance around my bicep. The top edge does need to be a bit bigger to like fit around the upper part of my arm and also connect to the bodice. But in order to make it bigger, I can just not sew down like one of the pleats that are like down under here. You won't be able to see it, it'll be under my arm. So these will need sleeve supports of some sort. I will do those later. I think it'll be easier to make the supports big enough to fit the sleeves than it will be to make the sleeves the right size to fit the supports. You know what I mean. The sleeves will be how big the sleeves will be, and the supports will support them supportively. So I'm going to finish up marking these sleeves, and then I can start pressing in these pleats, which will be the fun part. Hi, this is not a super necessary check-in. I just finished marking out all of the patterns on the sleeves, and I just needed to say that this took me 3 hours. The pen that I used to mark this, the heat erase pens from Wallach, they come with like just one pen and then multiple cartridges of ink to replace. I went through 4 of them. I just needed to share that because I feel kind of crazy. My sanity aside, it was time to start ironing the pleats, which was just as tedious as marking them out, but now I had a whole iron straining my wrist instead of just a little pen. But once all of the folds were looking crisp, I pinned them in place and sewed by machine to secure them. I sewed the short ends together to create the sleeve shape. I repeated the process for the second sleeve and then cut strips of fabric to bind the open edges. The little sleeve puffs were beginning to take shape, but they were a little too oblong for my liking and collapsed too easily while wearing them. So it was time for some support. From my research, it seems like most historical sleeve supports were basically just little pillows that went into your sleeves, but I wanted to make sure I kept these really lightweight so they wouldn't weigh down the pleats. I found one example though that used boning to create the structure, along with a blog post by Kenna Sews showing how she made some bone sleeve supports. I used these as a jumping off point for making my own. I cut rectangles of cotton, just slightly smaller than the sleeve pieces before pleating, and sewed the short ends together to make a ring. I then sewed on a line of twill tape along the middle of the ring to make a boning channel. I put in some gathering stitches along both open edges, then gathered the openings down to match the openings on the sleeves. I could then add in the boning and stitch the channel shut. So now that I have my very fancy set of water wings, I'm going to go ahead and tack the supports into the sleeves and then attach the sleeves to the bodice. And so that will finish that off, and then it's time to move on to the Bertha. In theory, it should just be 2 long rectangles of the black fabric pleated up and then reinforced. I feel like this should be pretty easy, but I'm prepared to be corrected. The Bertha would have been easy if I had just done things the way I knew I should have from the beginning. Things started out okay. I cut 2 long rectangles of fabric, and then, to make sure I got the sharpest pleats I could, I made a pleating board. I've done this on the channel before, but it's a super easy way to make pleats more precise. I marked out where I wanted my fabric to fold onto some cardstock, then scored and folded those marks. To keep my fabric from slipping out of the folds, I used basting spray, which is a temporary spray adhesive that's usually used for making quilts, I believe. I sprayed that onto the cardstock and then stuck the fabric to it. Then I could fold up the pleating board and fabric sandwich and press it with the iron. This gave me the crispiest pleats I have ever made, but it's also where things started to go awry. You see, I had cut my fabric strips slightly too narrow, so I wouldn't have quite enough seam allowance to just simply hem both of the long edges. That's fine, I could still finish them nicely. It would just take a bit of futzing. Then I realized that for the first half of the Bertha, I lined the top edge of the fabric with the edge of the pleating board, but for the second one, I lined up the bottom edges. I didn't even think about that. So the edges with the scant seam allowance were flip-flopped, and the 2 halves were not symmetrical. But with even more futzing, I was able to get all of the edges finished and all the pleats perfectly aligned. I reinforced the pieces with iron-on interfacing, which also sealed the pleats in place. I stitched the 2 pieces together at the center front, lining up the pleats as close as possible and making a nice wide V shape. Okay, so I've got, I think, the Bertha ready to attach. I don't know if I should put a lining on the back, because you shouldn't be able to see it. It's going to be like against my skin. I'll test it out and see. I might need to add something. I also might need to reinforce it more because I've been thinking I might remove the sleeves from the bodice and attach them to the Bertha instead. So I'm going to try out my initial plan first, just because I already have the sleeves sewn on. So I'm just going to baste this in place and try it on and see. Having the Bertha and sleeves unattached left these big gaps, so I went ahead and unpicked the sleeves from the bodice and attached them to the Bertha. And here we come to my biggest goof. Not adding the lining before the Bertha was attached to the bodice. It would have been so easy, but I thought I could get away without one at all. Unfortunately, once everything was assembled, I realized you could see bits at the back with just the raw iron-on interfacing, so it did need the lining. But instead of removing the Bertha, adding the lining, and reattaching it like a sensible person would, I tried to attach it by hand with the bodice and sleeves still on. This went about as well as you could expect, and I ended up unpicking and reattaching everything in bits and pieces, mostly off camera because it was so frustrating. But despite all that, I got all the ugly bits covered and finished off the bodice with some hook and bar closures at the center back to connect the ends of the Bertha. Okay, so the bodice is done. I've got a cold. It's time to move on to the next thing. I had initially planned on doing the full dress first before moving on to the accessories, so next up would be the skirt, but instead I'm going to work on the ribcage over corset piece next, because that is going to have a ton of beading, which is going to take a very long time, and I'm fairly certain I need more beads. I tried to do some math to estimate how much I should order, but I really don't know. It's a weird shape. I think the only way I'm gonna know is to work on it and see how far I can get with the quantity that I've ordered already. So I want to start on the rib cage, do the beading as far as I can get, and then see if I need to order more beads. And if I do, I can order them, and then while I'm waiting for those to ship, I can work on the skirt. So my plan for the rib cage is to make a wire frame and then wrap that in fabric the way you might do with like those fancy lampshades, and then do the beading onto the fabric. I also need to think more about how I'm going to be able to get this on and off, because I had initially been planning on just having this lace up the back and then I can just put it on, but the base of this is going to be wire, so it's going to be flexible, which would help getting it on and off, but I also don't want it to like bend out of shape. So I think I'm going to have to add some kind of like hinge mechanism either at the sides or at like the center front. I definitely want to keep the lacing at the back, because if I don't, I'll have to make beaded vertebrae, and I really don't want to do that. I had to draw vertebrae in my life drawing classes in college, and that was bad enough. I don't want to make them three-dimensional and out of beads. I also need to think about the structure of the bodice, because it's got the giant sleeves and the off-the-shoulder Bertha collar, so the sleeve openings need to be pretty big. I'm going to be making the base on the dress form, so I'm going to take off all this draping tape and then put on more in the design shape of the ribcage to use that as like a base. And one last thing before I get started, I have a special message for someone in particular. one of my best friends from high school. She is about to graduate with her doctorate in occupational therapy. We're all very proud. Everyone go say congratulations. She is, however, very annoying. When I was telling her about this project, and she was like, well, it has to be anatomically correct. I'll be judging you and critiquing you in the comments if it's not anatomically correct. And I'm just going to reiterate what I told you on that phone call. Real rib cages go inside. This one goes outside. Real rib cages don't have to go around your arms and giant pleated balloon sleeves or over your boobs. So this rib cage is going to be made out of wire and fabric and tiny pieces of glass. It's not going to be anatomically correct, and we're all just going to have to live with that. I'm going to do my best. I've got references that I'm going to follow as a guideline, but its main function is to look cool. So be normal about this is all I'm saying. I'll fight you. I love you. Bye. Okay, so I've got the base wireframe put together. I did a quick try on with the bodice and the corset and the hoop skirt. I need to make some modifications. First thing I need to change, I cannot do the floating ribs. I hadn't added them in yet, but the hoop skirt basically comes to like right here. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut the zip ties just below the last non-floating rib. The bigger thing that I need to do is I need to split this at the sides. So there's just gonna have to be a seam here and here. I think I can get away with leaving the pieces that come over the shoulder solid. So I'm gonna go ahead and make all those changes, and then I can start getting all of the fabric strips ready for this. For the fabric wrapping, I just cut long strips of white cotton and used a bias tape maker to press the long edges to the center. This prevented any raw fraying edges from peeking out, and the double thickness helped to smooth out the wire base a bit more. Then I began wrapping the wire base. Here you can get a better look at the structure. I used 2 gauges of wire, the thicker gold wire to form the outline of each piece, and the thinner red wire to fill in the space between the outlines. I also used zip ties to add more structure to the sternum at the center front and at the back to support the lacing loops, which were just more of the wire twisted into rings. I reinforced the connections with a little hot glue just to stabilize things before securing everything with the fabric wrapping. Once all the wire was completely covered, I stitched it all in place by hand. I also covered the lacing loops by crocheting over them with some lace weight yarn, and then stitched on some snaps for the side closures. The base was almost done, but before I could start beading, I needed to base paint the red portion so no white fabric showed through. In the past I've used acrylic paint, which was not the best choice because it dries very thick and it's really hard to sew through. So this time I used watercolor paint, which was much thinner and easier to sew through once dry. You're supposed to use fabric dye because it actually stains the fibers of the fabric instead of just sitting on top and being hard to sew through like the paint does, but I really didn't feel like trying to wrestle even a small part of my wire carcass into a dye bath, so I went with watercolor. It worked just fine and was not difficult to sew through at all. Once that had dried, I could finally start beading. I started with the unfractured side just to get a feel for stitching on such an oddly shaped base without having to worry about color changes. I used glass bugle beads and a mix of different shades of white. I had these slightly translucent, sort of milky beads, these clear, frosty, textured ones that reminded me of fancy salt, and these opaque, iridescent beads. I wanted to put these on the ribs randomly, but still keep a consistent ratio of each color, so I measured out a few scoops of each. 2 of the milky, 2 of the salty, and 1 of the shimmery, since those were the most expensive, and I wanted to use them more sparingly. When I'm working with bugle beads, I typically come up through the fabric, thread 2 beads onto my needle at a time, go back down through the fabric, then come back up in between those 2 beads and pass the needle through the second bead, and then repeat. This helps to keep your beads in neat rows, although working on flat fabric stretched taut in an embroidery hoop instead of on a simulacrum of a human ribcage also helps. I used a mix of red beads as well, a brighter scarlet and a darker burgundy, both slightly translucent. I also had some red teardrop beads in a variety of sizes, but those would go on later. I followed the shape of the chest wound with the red beads and blended them out into the white, creating a drippy splatter sort of pattern. I had been using red thread for the red beads and white thread on the white beads, but I found that using red thread on the white beads gave them a reddish cast and allowed me to create a bit of a gradient, like a spreading stain. When the front was fully covered, apart from the top two ribs on one side because I ran out of white beads, I added the teardrop beads on and around the chest wound running down the front. Okay, so I am done with the beading for now. I do still have these two ribs up at the top to do, and then the entire back half of it, but I'm out of the white beads at the moment. So I've got some more ordered. They are on their way. The rest of the beading that I have left should be fairly easy. It's all straight lines. None of this that, but I'm really happy with how this is turning out so far, and I'm very excited to keep working on it. But for now, I am moving on to the skirt. I've been wanting to try out cartridge pleats for a while. I think they look very cool, and cartridge pleats also take like a wide width of fabric and compress it down quite a bit, so I'll be able to get a very full skirt over this hoop skirt. So I did some samples. I did a little mini test yesterday to work out how much the fabric will shrink. Based on this, I'm going to need 6 times my waist measurement. For context, when you're doing gathering, 3 times your waist measurement is considered a lot. Like, that will give you a very full gathered skirt. This is gonna use twice that. Did I mention you have to do all the pleats by hand? I was debating whether or not I wanted to attach the skirt to the bodice or make it a separate piece, but then I tried everything on just to get some measurements to figure out like how long I need the skirt to be to fit over the hoop, and I realized this would be so annoying to put on if the skirt was attached to the bodice, so they're gonna be separates. One thing that's really annoying, I really wanted to hem the skirt panel first and then do all the gathers so I can hem it when it's just a big flat piece of fabric, but my bodice has a basque waist, so it's pointed in the front, so the cartridge pleats are gonna have to dip down in the front, so if I hemmed it as one straight rectangle, the hem would dip down in the front on the skirt. So I'm going to have to do all of the pleats, get it all assembled at the top, add all the dress hooks, get it attached to the bodice, and then level off the hem. So that means I can start marking my pleats, which is going to take forever. After measuring and tearing my fabric to size, I folded and pressed the top edge down by 2 inches to double up the fabric and make the cartridge pleats a bit thicker. I used the selvage edge for this, so I didn't need to bother with finishing it. I sewed the short ends together to make a giant tube, leaving the top 10 inches open to be able to get the skirt on. I finished the edges of the opening with a narrow hem. I made a paper guide to speed up the pleat making process. I drew a horizontal line 1/4 inch from the top of the paper, and then a second 1/2 inch below that. Then I drew vertical lines 1/4 inch apart all along the length of the paper. I punched holes at every point where the lines intersected, and then I could just line the guide up to the folded edge of the fabric and mark 2 rows of dots all along the length of the skirt. Then I could put in my gathering threads. I split the skirt into 4 sections so none of the threads would be insanely long, and then I just did a running stitch with a heavy-duty thread, passing the needle in and out of the fabric on the dots. Since the skirt was going to be separate from the bodice, I needed to make a waistband. I traced the bottom edge of the bodice so I could match the curves and then cut out my pieces. It was very simple, just 2 layers of the black taffeta with some iron-on interfacing on 1 layer for stability, sewn right sides together and turned right side out. Once my mustache was ready, I could begin gathering down the pleats. I marked out 4 sections onto my waistband and then gathered the 4 sections of the skirt down to fit. I tied the threads off to lock the pleats in place, and then I could whip stitch the trough of each little sine wave to the waistband. I used the excess gathering thread I had cut off for this, and for the rest of the hand sewing on this project, and I still didn't use it all up. That's how much the skirt gathered down. With all of the gathers secured, I could put the skirt on my dress form with the hoops and petticoat to mark out the hem. I trimmed the fabric down and pressed it into a fairly wide double fold hem. And apparently I hadn't had enough of hand sewing after the cartridge pleats, so I decided I needed to do a blind hem by hand. It isn't perfectly invisible since this fabric is so smooth and shiny, the little prick stitches on the front do show, but I still think it looks pretty clean. I fear that deciding to do even more slow, tedious hand sewing for this project is starting to make me sympathize with the narrator of the Telltale Heart a little bit too much. I do feel myself descending into madness. But with the hem done, all that was left for the skirt was to sew on some ribbon ties for the back closure and add some hooks and bars to the bodice and waistband respectively to ensure that they wouldn't slip out of alignment. So the skirt is done, so that means the full dress is finished finally. I do still have some work to do on the ribcage, but I'm going to hold off on that for now, and instead I'm going to work on the gloves. So the gloves are supposed to kind of look like my hands are like covered in blood, but the blood is made of rhinestones. Which is what my actual blood looks like, fun fact. So for like the base layer of the gloves, what I'm going to apply the rhinestones to, I want just kind of like a lightweight, thin layer that's red as a base, but then transitions into a skin tone. For that, I've got some power mesh in 2 colors. I could only get a yard as the smallest amount. It's a very thin, lightweight, very stretchy material. So I've got a cut of that in a dark red and a cut in a light nude color that matches my skin tone as close as I could get with the options available. I've never worked with this before. I'm a little worried. I know I don't like working with lightweight fabrics or stretch fabrics or knits or mesh. So I'm sure this lightweight stretchy knit mesh will just go swimmingly. I started out by cutting 2 blocks of each color, short for the red and longer for the nude, then sewed them together with a diagonal seam so I could have an asymmetrical shape. I did remember to sew these with a zigzag stitch to give the seam some stretch, but I did not remember to switch to a ballpoint needle. It didn't cause any issues sewing with the regular needle in the machine, which is why I didn't remember to switch, but I did end up with tiny little hairs of broken elastic surrounding all my seams. I don't know if that impacted the stretchiness of the fabric as well, but I would have bigger challenges in that department, as you will soon see. For the actual pattern, I just traced my hand onto some paper, cut that out, and pinned it in between the 2 color-blocked panels.
I don't think you can see that, but I made it a turkey.
I sewed around the paper hand, leaving a little gap between the edge of the paper and the seam to account for the dimensionality of my hands. This loosey-goosey approach to glove making only worked because I was using such a stretchy fabric. Normally you have to do a lot of really intricate patterning to get the fit right, but power mesh can absolve you of many sins. I removed the paper template and cut away the excess fabric and ended up with not a bad looking glove. Some wrinkles between the fingers, but not too shabby for my first time making gloves. I finished seaming up the arm part of the glove and then repeated the process to make a complete pair. That wasn't too bad. They're not perfect. They're certainly kind of lumpy and bumpy, and you can see the seams, but they're gonna get covered in rhinestones, so I don't care. I probably should have changed the thread color once I got to the skin tone mesh, but I just kept the red in, which I kind of think looks cool. It kind of looks like stitches. I mean, it is stitches, but like skin stitches. So the next step is going to be all of the rhinestoning. I've never done any stoning personally. The closest I've come is reading The Lottery in my 9th grade English class. So I've got some Gemtac glue. This was recommended online as like a good glue for rhinestones that wasn't super toxic. I've also got all my rhinestones, which, well, since I've never done any rhinestoning, I didn't really know how much I should order. I couldn't really estimate how many I would need. So I did some math. You know, the palm of your hand is basically a rectangle. Your fingers are basically cylinders. Double them for 2 hands, round up a little as you go. Better to have a little extra instead of a little bit less. And I always like to order a little bit more than I think I'll need just to cover my bases, but I have a lot. I have a lot of rhinestones. I'm not planning on doing like my whole arm. I'm really just planning on doing the red part really densely and then have it kind of fade out into like splatters and drips as it gets into the skin tone part. And I also plan on not doing the palm of my hand so I can still like do stuff. In order to apply all the rhinestones, I will need both hands, so I'll need to take the rhinestones off, and also I don't want the glue to dry to me, but I still want a 3-dimensional form of my hand in there. So that means I need to make models of my hands. I'm going to get some latex gloves, put them on, and then wrap them in tape. I stuffed my tape hands with fabric scraps so they'd keep their shape and taped on some paper towel tubes for the arms. I painted some fake nails a nice shimmery red, glued them onto the fingertips, and then I could begin applying the rhinestones. Okay, so I finished rhinestoning the first glove. I think it looks pretty cool. I'm very happy with it. I'm going to let this dry before trying to take it off of the form, which I'm a little worried about that part. It's pretty well stuck on there. It's all covered in like masking tape and plastic wrap, so it should peel off decently. I'm just really worried about having to take these off, and I'm also worried about having to put them on. I would like to not destroy the hand forms. I think these were really, I was gonna say they were really handy, which they are in more than one way. I'm letting that dry, then I'll try to take it off the form, and I don't want to start on the second glove until I've gotten that one off and like know it's possible. So that way I only waste a lot of rhinestones instead of a ton. Actually, not even that much. I have barely made a dent in my rhinestone collection here. I have two colors, a light red and a dark red, and then two sizes of each of those colors, 4mm and 6mm. So I've been taking like scoops of each of those and mixing them together, so I've been dipping into 4 different bags, but each of them is still probably like a third full, and I haven't opened any of the other bags, so I will have enough for this project. And probably the next 7 years. I also want to do some little blood splatter appliques that I can like stick to my face, and I want those to be rhinestoned as well. So my plan for those is to use Mod Podge as the base. I've got some freezer paper, and I know the Mod Podge peels off of that very nicely. So I'm going to go outside and make some splats, let those dry, and then cover them in rhinestones. So this has been drying overnight, and it's time to try and actually remove it, so. Okay, it's peeling off the plastic part fine. I'm worried because the actual hand part, in addition to being hand-shaped, is covered in masking tape. Oh, there's so much glue. Oh my god, it's still wet. I don't think it'll dry if I don't peel it off. Okay, yeah, I think I'm gonna have to cut up the hands. Me shove this finger back in. Okay, so I have some cleanup to do. These were already hard to get on before I put the rhinestones on. It worked. It worked. Oh god, more rhinestones. Considering how many are on my hand currently, and this is how many fell off, not too bad. I re-glued the rhinestones that fell off just to fill in any obvious gaps, and re-watched Ash Bentley's finger costume video as I worked for moral support. To avoid a repeat performance of struggle glove peeling in D minor, I wrapped the second hand in packing tape, which has a glossy finish, so hopefully the glue would peel off of it a bit easier. I gloved up and began rhinestoning again. This time I let the glove dry for 2 full days before trying to take it off, and the packing tape did help. This one only took 20 minutes. Now, you've probably been thinking for a while, hey, wouldn't soaking the power mesh in glue totally ruin its stretchiness, the main reason you chose to work with this fabric in the first place? Well, yes it does. I knew from the beginning that gluing the rhinestones onto the mesh would reduce its stretchiness, but I didn't expect the gloves to have almost zero stretch at all in the rhinestone areas. This made them so difficult to get on and off, to the point that I actually had a bit of a casualty when trying them on, and I ripped part of the seam on the bicep. I didn't get a chance to repair it, so if you see that in the reveal, No, you didn't. Looking back at my inspiration images, none of those are totally covered in rhinestones, so I don't know if there's a better way I could have gone about making these. If you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them in the comments. I mean, the gloves look great, but at what cost? But with the gloves done, the only thing left was to finish the beading on the ribcage. My second order of beads had come in, and I spent the next few days finishing that up until the entire project was complete. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wishing them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness. Until, at length, I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grow very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly and more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting, and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, no! They heard! They suspected! They knew! And they were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt I must scream or die. And now, again, hark! Louder, 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 louder! Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here, it is the beating of his hideous heart. Hope you all enjoyed that little dramatic reading. I realized Poe's work is in the public domain, so I kinda had to. I had a lot of fun with it. I had a lot of fun with this whole project. I'm so happy with how it came out. There are, of course, a few things I could improve, the gloves being the biggest. The ribcage is my favorite part. I am obsessed with it. I want to wear it forever. So thank you for watching the video. It's been a real labor of love. I've been working on this in earnest since August, but I've been planning and testing and making all the samples for almost a year. I think this is going to be my longest video yet, so thank you for sticking around till the end, and thank you to my patrons for supporting me and this channel, and for funding my bugle beat habit. Thank you for enabling me. And an extra special thank you to those in the Magnanimous Maelstroms tier, Perfect Primrose, and Bear Hardy. But thank you all again just for watching. It truly means the world to me, and I hope you have a happy Halloween.